Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to The Cutting Room, the show where we talk to industry-leading content marketers about their philosophy, process, and pregame when it relates to content marketing. I am your host, Tommy Walker, and I am very excited to have our guest on tonight. His name is Jude Charles. We are going to be talking about a number of different things. He is a storyteller, first and foremost. He does a lot of video docuseries for companies like Google, Steve Harvey, Coldwell Banker, really big, decent brands, and he focuses on the art of storytelling as like the primary focus of his business. And what I'm excited about to talk to Jude about today is the focus on video editing. We talk a lot about content and specifically articles on the show, but this unique perspective that Jude has on video and how that will play into the storytelling structure, absolutely fascinating to me. And I cannot wait and stress enough that this is going to be one of the more valuable episodes that we've ever had. Super excited. I would like to encourage you, if you are currently live, let's make the most of the format. Why not say hi in the chat? Tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, maybe even drop a link to your website. Would love to get some engagement here. And if you have any questions for Jude along the way, please go ahead and just ask, and we'll make sure that we address that in the conversation. So without any further ado, I am going to bring Jude onto the stream here, and let's get started.
Hey.
How's it going, Jude? Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah, no problem. We were commenting earlier how we both have the same chair, which yes, I think is fantastic. We've already got like-mindedness here. All right, so I hate preamble. We kind of talked about this in the pre-call here, so we're just going to jump straight into it. Tell me a little bit about your content marketing philosophy and the impact it can have on a business.
Yeah, I have two main points when it comes to my philosophy. Number one is storytelling. When I'm speaking on stage, when I am writing an article, when I am creating a video, I'm always thinking, what is the story I want to tell that's going to drive home this point? So that's number one. But number two is the visual part of that, the demonstration of that, the show your work part of that. So whenever I'm creating an article, I think of what's the one main story that's going to drive this point home, and then how do I want to show the things or the steps that are happening in this article that I want to teach. And so that's really my philosophy when I think about content, because if you can tell a story and take someone on a journey, but then you also show them what you want them to take away, that's what makes it influential. That's what makes it entertaining. And then that's what takes them all the way home to make sure that this article you have written drives home the point. Because that's the whole point of writing the article, right? Is to get someone to take action. And so that, to me, is my philosophy when it comes to writing.
I think that's fantastic. And one of the things you were saying on your Twitter that was really stood out to me was that it's in the small moments, it's in the micro moments that these stories happen. Tell me a little bit about how you're diving into those details to appeal to the senses. Not only in like as it relates to video, you've got all of your senses, the ability to give that, but in all formats that you're talking about, because even in the audiobook, dramatic demonstration, by the way, if you're listening, we'll drop a link in the chat. Even in that, you do a really good job of engaging the senses. Can you talk about that a little bit more, please?
I think so. I have a music background. In middle school, I played the cello. In high school, I played the French horn, and I also used to sing in the chorus.
Okay.
The reason I'm starting with that is because I believe that music has a rhythm, right? Like, so there's beats, there's a steady rhythm that happens. And I think the same thing, in my opinion, happens when you are writing. There's a rhythm, right? There's a rhythm, there's a pace. You don't just hit them with a big block of information and then give them one sentence. You layer it on slowly so that you allow the person to begin to digest and you allow them to begin to take this journey with you that you want them to go down.
Yes.
To me, again, when I think about creating content, you talk about the audiobook. The audiobook, I'm pacing and I'm creating this rhythm. Um, I don't want it to be too much of me reading. I think we should talk about that a little bit. The audiobook is not just me reading the book. I'm also including segments of podcasts that I've been featured on.
Yep.
And then I also include, because I interviewed my clients for the book, I include their audio of them talking about the experience. There's this pace, there's this rhythm. It's not just this one monotone dialogue that's happening, it's a conversation that's happening. And I
Mm-hmm.
think the same thing happens when you're writing content. It's a conversation, not just a speech. It is a conversation. There should be questions being asked, there should be reactions, but again, it's a pace, it's a rhythm. When you're making music, um, there's usually about three, not choruses, what do they call that? Three
Refrains.
refrains, right?
You've got your verses and then your refrains, maybe a
There's
coda.
three verses,
I
three refrains, right? And the refrain is always bringing you back to the main point of the song,
right.
right? Whereas the verses are telling you the story. Theoretically, they're telling you the story. I think the same thing should happen in writing, where, or in any content that you're creating. You give me the hook, you give me the beginning of the story, you give me the middle, you give me the end, but you always come back to the main point. What is the point of you telling me this story? Um, I I have just taken all these influences in my life, music, video production, writing, and I've brought them together to realize the similarities. And the similarities to me is rhythm. There's
Yeah.
always a rhythm. There's always a pace. When you're watching a movie at the movie theater, there's always a pace, right? Like there's always, it's slow in the beginning, but then as soon as 30 minutes in, an hour in, you're sitting on the edge of your chair. And that's the kind of the same thing I want to create in my writing.
I think that's fantastic. I was a film student, an acting student for a long time, and I did like all state chorus. Like we have a
Yeah.
very similar background in that regard. We won
Yeah.
championships. It was awesome.
Yeah.
But I talk about that a lot too. Is like the musicality of words and the application of that is different from medium to medium,
Mm-hmm.
but in writing specifically you see so much of the same tone, and it could be that anyone's byline could be on it, and it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The musicality of the words and how you string them together is so important and not talked about enough.
Yeah.
The through line too, like the through line coming back to the music. I love that you put it that way. Can you talk about that a little bit more, like from the technique perspective? Obviously you didn't start there. You started in
Yeah.
one medium and started like going to another. What was that process like for you learning how to apply that from one medium to the next?
I think it's a similar process. I like analogies, so I'm gonna use the process of like when you first get when you get a first job, right?
Yep.
My very first job was working at a grocery store, um, and you realize over time there's a process, a system that happens, and I think when I started with music, I was just paying attention to notes. How do I read notes? How does it sound? My orchestra teacher used to she always used to put emphasis on you don't always want to be loud, right? You want it to be felt, but you don't want it to be loud. And there's a difference between those two, right? Because those are two different senses. When you're hearing something versus when you are feeling it with your hands, there's a way that you can place your hands on something and you place it really rough, or you could just place your hand on it and it goes across really smooth, right? And I think again, when I started in music, I picked up a video camera in high school, and I remember the same thing, remembering like, oh, if I turn the camera really quick, that's jarring versus if I just ease into it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I started talking about like your first job because I think your first job teaches you the most important thing that you take to your next job. And what working at a grocery store taught me is that I want to enjoy what I do. The people that came into work every day, they were in their 30s and 40s. I was only 14 or 15, but they were in their 30s and 40s, and they would complain about their work every day. And
Hmm.
I remembered thinking to myself, whatever I'm going to choose as a career, I never want to complain about it. I want to wake up every morning and have a choice, right? And that influenced how I became and got into video production because at 17 years old, my teacher, Mrs. Donnelly, taught me everything she knew about video production. And then May 4th, 2006, she said to me, Jude, you're very talented at video production. You should start a business. I'm the youngest of 10 children. No one in my family were entrepreneurs. My dad worked as a construction worker, and my mom worked at a chair factory. But the following day, May 5th, 2006, Mrs. Donnelly came into the classroom with a yellow envelope, and she handed it to me. And I was like, what is this? She said, look inside. Inside of this yellow envelope was my first set of business cards at 17 years old. And I still have the business card to this day
Oh,
that I
wow.
keep at my desk because, again, it influenced I remembered sitting or standing as a cashier at the grocery store thinking to myself, I don't want to do something that I don't enjoy. But here's a teacher who taught me everything she knew about video production. Is like, why not go out and do this? So when you ask me like the influences and how things led over, it's like there's always if you pay attention and you're intentional, even if you don't know what you want to do in life, they help guide you along the journey, right? And your
Yeah.
story is developing without you knowing, but these are the things that influence you. I never knew, it took me years to realize how much music had influenced me, but it was always after I would show the first couple drafts of my documentaries that I was creating. And someone would always say to me, the music is really on point. And it never dawned on me that it was music that was helping me edit. It was music that was helping me move this story along. Um, it's just fascinating to me how all these early influences can help you create content in an engaging way. Even the way you grew up, if you grew up on a farm, there's a process as to
Hmm.
how you farm and how you put seed in the ground and have to wait for that seed to actually give you a plant or a fruit, right? So yeah, it's just there's art and there's rhythm, there's systems to everything, and I think that's what's helped me tell stories over time.
Well, I think what's interesting about this too, because you had talked about movies um, and what we don't talk about enough, and if anybody's here, like if you really break down a movie, right, the first 15 minutes of that movie are always the thing that's setting up the problem.
Yep.
After the 15-minute mark, you've got the inciting incident that brings the story, kicks the story off into gear, right? And if you really look at and really study the way that these structures work, you'll realize that there's a basic structure that all of these things have in common. And then from there, it's how those notes are played, if you will,
Yeah.
how those individual notes and the music that's happening, not literal music, but music and pacing and all of that is what makes a movie, and a short,
Yep.
and all of these things really, really compelling. Um, God, there's so many different jumping off points there. Um, but I mean, I'm curious, like, okay, so format to format. Let's kind of talk about that because with music and with movies and video, like I totally know what you mean because you can edit on the beat, right?
Yep.
And you should edit on the beat and like set the tone and all of that. You have more senses to engage, right?
Yes.
But you're a serial podcast guest.
Hmm.
So you're using primarily your voice
Yes.
in your story, like your voice and your words, and you were an author. Talk about how you are using that background um, when you have fewer senses to work with.
I am relying on visual words. So I can, if you're only listening to me right now, I can say I hit you on the nose, or I can say I popped you on the nose.
Mm.
If I pop you on the nose, that's a different reaction. You know what a pop feels like and what a pop sounds like. When I am telling my story about Mrs. Donnelly giving me my first set of business cards, I'm not just telling you she gave me my first set of business cards. I'm telling you, there was this yellow envelope that she handed to me. So in your mind, you can see a yellow envelope being handed to you. So that's visual words. But the other thing is my pacing. So there's oftentimes I'll tell a story. Let me tell this one story. It's a very short story, but it's when I'm talking about transformational storytelling, I tell the story of a fitness coach who she teaches women who are in their 40s. She helps them get fit. And she received one day a text message from her client, and the text message is a picture of an empty plane, and then in the words that are written there, the client says, "This is the very first time in my life I haven't had to ask for a seatbelt extension." Whenever I'm telling that story, I give a very long pause to allow that to sink in. It's pacing. It is not just rushing through the words, but it is slowing down so that you can understand the words. Or sometimes if I get really excited, I raise my voice and I start speaking fast. So when I'm thinking of pacing, I'm thinking of rhythm, I'm thinking of how do I want this person to feel as I'm telling this story.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It is how I'm able to communicate effectively. Like you mentioned, I'm a serial podcast guest. It is for that reason, is I'm always testing what works, what doesn't work. I'm taking you on a journey. Have you ever been to Spokane, Washington?
No, I haven't.
You haven't. Spokane, Washington. So I live in South Florida, in Pompano Beach, Florida, and Spokane, Washington it reminds me of home. And I went there in 2014 to go to a leadership conference. So I'm really big on leadership. And I went to a leadership conference there. And I had this crazy idea. Because Spokane, Washington is in the state of Washington, which means it's in the furthest northwest point of America, and I live in the furthest southeast point of America, I told myself, you know what, it would be a really great idea to take a bus home. So I decided to take a Greyhound bus, 3-day trip. By the second day, we got to Chicago, and I was miserable. And I happened to turn on my phone because my phone was off the whole time. I turn on my phone, and I get a text message from my sister, "Call me ASAP." Well, I braced myself because I knew it was either my mom or my dad. So my mom in 2014 was suffering from depression and had recently tried to commit suicide. My dad had recently been diagnosed with prostate cancer. And so when I get a text from my sister saying, "Call me back, it's urgent," it causes me to think, okay, this is it. This is the moment that changes everything. I called my sister back. Unfortunately, it ended up being my father, and I took the first flight back home. They had found him unresponsive in the house. And I knew he had passed away. They just didn't want to tell me yet. So this is 8 p.m. I take the first flight back home, which is 6 a.m. the next morning. And my brother comes to pick me up. We don't say a word. I hug him. He came with his niece, my niece, his daughter. And so I sit in the back car with my niece, and I'm looking off in space because at the time I'm 25 years old. That felt lost, not thinking to myself I would lose my father. And my niece says, "Uncle, why did Grandpa have to die? Why did Grandpa have to die?" That question rang in my ear. I didn't answer her. I just looked at her and then looked away. But within the next 48 hours, I got my response as to why Grandpa had to die, because I found myself leading my family through this difficult journey. Remember, I'm the youngest of 10 children, but they all leaned on me to guide them through this journey of making preparations and understanding how we would move forward. And a week later, I found myself giving my father's eulogy at the funeral. Youngest of 10, never expected it. But why did Grandpa have to die? Because my role in life is to be a leader. I've always ran away from leadership because I always thought if you're a leader, you're the president or you're the pastor of a church or you're the person that's front and center.
Right.
Well, I realized when I looked at the word as I was preparing for his eulogy, I looked at the word to lead, and it just means to guide a group of people along a journey. That's it. And that's what I've literally been doing, not only my whole life, but even at that point, 25, I had been running the business for almost 8 years at that point. And that's what I did for my clients. I would help them tell their stories. I would guide them on their journey as they are looking to grow their business. And so my mission and vision in life is to lead and empower entrepreneurs to have relentless, unwavering courage. But that happened in that one moment. I tell that story because normally I tell that story while I'm on stage, but I also tell the story so that you can hear and understand the pacing as I'm telling the story. You are leaned in, waiting for me to finish the story because you have no idea where I'm going with it. I start with
Right.
Spokane, Washington, this weird and funny place, and then I go into, unfortunately, what wasn't the best moment of my life, but I bring it back to purpose. There is this rhythm, there is this pace, there is this journey that I bring you on that commands you to listen. And so when you ask me, like, how do I do it in different mediums? That's how I'm thinking about it. I'm always thinking of pace. I'm always thinking of visuals. I'm always thinking of what are the words that are going to make you stop and think? And do I give you that time to stop and think? To me, that's how you do content. It's just storytelling is the key. No way about it. Storytelling is the key.
So I'm on the verge of tears, first and foremost, because that's a heck of a story. But I think what's interesting to point out in that, right? And if we were to get technical on like writing or whatever, right, on any medium, in writing it would be sentence structure and length and
Yeah.
the word choice and all of that. In video, it's how long you hold on to a shot, right? The music that's actually happening in the background. But I think what's interesting and what's most important about what you were saying is that there are universal truths that you're telling, right? Like, I've never been to Spokane, Washington, so maybe I can't visualize what that is.
Yeah.
But I have been on a bus for a long period of time.
Yeah.
I have gotten that text message, not that text message, but the one that induces panic.
Right. Yep.
We've had these universal truths that that it helps connect. It helps make whatever information that you're telling connect more. And that doesn't matter if it's just, it's not just throwing stats at a wall. If you're in B2B content, it's like making meaning of those stats and what those would be, right?
Making meaning of.
Yeah.
I think that's the important part. Like, I don't want people to miss that as you're saying this because it's very important. Making meaning of. I could have easily just told you, Tommy, my mission and vision in life is to lead and empower entrepreneurs to have relentless courage. That means nothing to you without that story I just told you. It makes meaning of. I brought you into a very specific moment in time in my life that happened 8 years ago. We're in 2022 now. It happened in 2014.
Yep.
But it made meaning of the statement that I made at the very end.
Right.
So I just want to make sure your audience they catch on to that. We make meaning of, especially in B2B, where I think you're right. People want to throw stats at you, and it's like, why don't you get it? Like, this is so important. They don't get how important it is because you haven't asked them to care. You haven't invited them to care. You haven't made meaning of. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just it's simple, but again, I want to drive home the point. Yeah.
No, I mean it's the concept is simple. The process to get there, and this is a perfect segue, but the process to get there is not. And I think what's fascinating about that, the thing you said at the end, that's where everybody starts. right?
Yeah.
We build leaders, or we believe in leadership, and blah blah blah. We've seen that
Yeah.
tagline. You could see that tagline 100,000 times, right?
Yeah.
And there's no distinction from business to business. What I'm curious about now, and then we're going to get into the edit very quickly or very soon here. But what I'm very curious about is the process that you're getting, or the process that you're teaching to your clients to get to that point where you're making meaning of the words that are on the page or the video that's on the screen, or etc.
Yeah, I usually start that process with Simon Sinek's "Start with Why."
Okay.
Um, so Simon Sinek says most companies can tell you what they do. Some can even tell you how they do it differently, but very few can tell you why they do what they do. And what I have discovered over the 15 years that I've been doing this is the why is usually the story. Um, why do I wake up every morning and am passionate about storytelling? It's because of the teacher at 17 years old who handed me my first set of business cards, who handed me a dramatic demonstration that I could be an entrepreneur, that all I needed was business cards and a camera. At least that's what I naively thought about. Um, and so I like to dig deep into the why. If you're going to tell me, like you made the joke of like, we believe in developing leaders. Okay, why? Why does that matter? Why you?
Right.
Right. I think oftentimes as entrepreneurs, as businesses, what we don't realize customers or clients are thinking of is why should I do business with you versus any and everybody else?
Mm.
When you're writing content, why should I give you my attention versus any and everybody else? Right. And usually that why, again, I think value, the why is a story, but the value that you bring is your story as well.
I'm going to stop right there for a second, because we talk to a lot of content marketing leads in here,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of decisions are made by committee.
Mm-hmm.
And the story that you want to tell, where I'm going with this essentially, is how, as a cog in the wheel, are you helping those people or encouraging those people to tell that story upwards to get that out to the customer base?
The easiest and most effective way to tell that story, to even to get everybody on board on the same page, I think, is you remind yourself of the why of the client or the why of the person you're writing for.
Okay.
So it's kind of like the story I told of the woman who sent the picture of an empty plane. Like, as a fitness coach, you're no longer thinking about, oh, I can help someone lose weight. No, you're thinking about, I could free this person from the anxiety and the embarrassment that they feel every time they get on an airplane. When let's say you're a CMO and you have to convince the CEO to do this marketing campaign that maybe involves a certain amount of articles to write. Why we're doing it, why we're creating this campaign is not for, yes, the company theoretically we want to make more money, but we want to continue to bring the right people on this journey with us too.
Yep.
And if you understand the transformation that you're making in someone, like the person that's reading your article, if you understand the transformation that you're helping them make, that's the story you tell. That's the story you bring and say, hey, I'm writing this article. This is the information, but I really want you to understand who's going to be reading it. And the information that when they get this information, now they'll be forever changed. To me, that's how I think about even. So I write a newsletter. And even when I'm writing my newsletter, I'm thinking of that. Like, I write about dramatic leverage, which is what I call the business side of storytelling. It's not just telling your story, but how do you leverage the story? And I'm always thinking, okay, how is this person going to actually use this story? Like you're talking about right now. You stop me, you ask me, okay, if it's a marketing lead, how do I convince other people to go on this journey with me? I think you tell them the story. I'm biased, but I've also seen it happen over and over. Like when you focus on the story, you're able to help take people further along.
Yeah. And I've worked within large orgs, right? Like massive big companies. And what's hard as the storyteller is reminding leadership of why the business does what it does, right?
Yep.
It's, you become so disconnected from the customer base when you have several layers of people that you even have to go through to talk to them, that it's very important to tell that story of those customers to the leadership and remind them, because they might not be passionate. They might just be there for the paycheck. But
Mm-hmm.
if you remind them why the business even exists in the first place, and not the sanitized version that, the CMO or the CEO is going to give you on the mission statement of why we do this, but like really help people understand the problem and the challenge and like the real life circumstances, that's when you're able to get them to connect with it and then have that buy-in for that next level, right?
Yeah.
Now we're gonna hop into the article now, because we're at the half-hour mark, and I could talk about this for hours. Like, we
Yeah.
could go on for forever. But this is a perfect point to ask a little bit more about your pregame before you're evaluating any level of content in general with a capital C.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's jump into the piece itself.
Yeah.
And if anybody wants to follow along, you can do so over here in the link that we just put in the chat. And I also want to encourage people. We are asking for feedback on the show itself. So we're going to put a link to a type form in the chat as well, and just kind of get your thoughts on the chat and how you feel about the show in general. All right. If you want to share your screen there, Jude, go ahead and we'll jump right in.
Cool. And Corey, thank you for that. I'm looking at the comments now. Corey said a credible story. Thank you for that, Corey, and thank you for joining us live. So yeah, how do you want to break this down? Immediately I have a few thoughts, but how do you want to break this down, Tom?
Yeah. So before you even look at a piece, before you even look at the words or the raw footage, or like before you're sitting down at the editing bay, what are you doing to get yourself into the mindset? And
I
then
think
hopping in.
Before I even write, I'm thinking of what's the point that I want to make for the article. And then I'm thinking of what's the story that's going to help me make that point. So even something like this, like I'm looking at this, the co-schedule moat. I'm wondering, okay, I don't even work on the headline first. I just work on like, what is the point? If I share this with you, this article, what is the point that I'm looking to make? And mainly because I want to always come back to that point. I want to remind you in every sentence that I write, I want it to lead back to the point that I'm making. And then the story, I'm looking for this very specific moment in time. Now, the story doesn't always have to include me in it. Sometimes it can include someone else. Like I've been reading the autobiography of Carl Icahn, who is a finance guy out of New York, billionaire. And he has a book called King Icahn. And in one of the articles I wrote recently, I mentioned his story and how he walks into a meeting. He's a great negotiator, but he walks into a meeting late because he wants to have the upper hand. When his whole team is negotiating, he'll walk in 2 hours late because part of the team that he's negotiating against, they're already tired, and he wants to wear you down. And so I'll tell that story as I'm writing the article. So the story doesn't always have to include me. It's just like, what is the story that's going to help me drive home the point of what I'm making? And so that's what I look for first.
All right.
That's what I look for first. But in looking at this one though, to me, the heading is the heading is a bit confusing. The co-schedule moat, leveraging competition-free content to build a $5 million annual revenue. I forget what ARR means.
Annual recurring revenue.
Annual recurring revenue SaaS company. Got it. So to me, I have no idea what competition-free content is. Like theoretically, I might know, but I think I would rewrite this headline to make it simpler. I know what a moat is because of Warren Buffett. That's the first thing I think of is Warren Buffett. But I would rewrite this to how to build a $5 million ARR SaaS company by thinking of creating unique content. Or like it would just I just would look for simpler terms to drive this point home. It's like there's a lot of, in my opinion, there's a lot of jargon starting it out that I don't know that I would understand as a person who's like coming to this article for the first time. Now, I understand what a SaaS company is. I understand that $5 million in annual recurring revenue is a lot. But the competition-free content, I don't know that what am I getting myself into? And I don't know what co-schedule is either. As so the audience would be important too. Like, who am I writing to? Who am I writing to make sure like they're understanding and I'm not using too much jargon when they're coming to this article. As I get into the article, so in 2010, Garrett and Justin co-founded Today Made, a web development agency. They discovered most of their clients find it challenging to effectively manage their social media and editorial calendar. 8 years later, after launching the company from the Peace Garden state, they achieved the following. So this is good information starting out, but what I like to do, and this is usually in any content that I create, I like to drop you into the middle of the story. So it's a lot of information coming into it. But again, I don't get the reason that I should care about this information because you told me that we would look at competition-free content and we don't jump right into competition-free content. So that's kind of my thought around it. Key takeaways include what the Blue Ocean strategy entails, how to grow an email list of 1,000 subscribers. Okay. It's something that I definitely may want to do. I think there's this term that's used in journalism, don't bury the lead. So if we're talking about building a $5 million annual recurring revenue SaaS company, I'm thinking of how to grow an email list of 1,000 subscribers using content upgrades and downloadable templates. That's burying the lead. Like, that's fascinating to me. That's an immediate, how do I do that? Right? And that, to me, again, just going through it, reading it for the first time, it's like, oh, maybe that's one of the ways they did it. But I have to go past 3 paragraphs to get to that point. So I would lead with a story that leads here. Because competition-free content, to me, based on who's writing this, that's a word that they came up with because I've never heard that term before. I mean, I get it. Again, theoretically, I get it, but I've never heard it before. So we go into what is the Blue Ocean strategy. I like the graphs. I like the images.
I think what's interesting about this piece,
yeah,
right? And I'm going to, if you could scroll back up, right, is we started talking about the musicality of content in general.
Yeah.
And starting at the very beginning here, right? That headline is very difficult. You couldn't sing that headline. It doesn't sing.
No.
Right? It would be very difficult to say out loud. It's very long to read. And I think the big part for me is that, and I hate to say this, but it's like there's a lot of big words. There's a lot of syllables happening in here, right? If you start to count the syllables, and this is what I really look at when I really dig into my own edits, is I will count how many syllables are being put out there, because too many syllables all at once are taxing to read.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's if you're looking at music, it's the tempo, it's the measure, and syllables are important. And then that goes to what you were saying about word choice.
Yeah.
Right. It has to be intentional.
It has to be intentional. It has to be easy to read. I think. I mean, to your point, again, there's a lot of syllables. There's a lot of jargon that before I could even get to, like, I'm trying to reread this to get to the article, which it creates so much work that I almost don't want to read it. And so, but there's one thing that was fascinating to me because I took a quick look at this before we even started. And it says, let's dive in. But there was a story as I read through this, again, going back to burying the lead. I would have started here because this was fascinating to me. It says, some months ago, I sent a pitch to write a guest post for CoSchedule, and their former inbound marketing director did not approve it because it has a low search volume on RFs, right? That was fascinating to me because it immediately drops me into, like, I would have started with that. Again, I'm not sure who wrote this, but I would have started with that because that would have taken me on the journey of now, hey, I tried to submit a pitch, I got rejected. But it made me go back and think, why did I get rejected? What is this company doing? What is their strategy? And then bring me into the strategy that led you to realize they have a blue ocean strategy. Because as content marketers, we are looking for these collaborations, right? We're looking at, how do I submit? How do I pitch to someone else? How do I better understand their strategy? I would have started with that story, then go back to, after doing some research, I realized, oh, these guys are pretty different. Like Garrett and Justin, they started as a web development agency. But then they realized they had something else and they created CoSchedule. That brings me on a journey now where you dropped me into the middle of your story where you had actually pitched them, where you pitched the CMO and he told you, look, this is not the right fit based on the search terms. Then go back into, now you can put all this information because now you've given me a reason to care, right? You've given me a reason to care. There was the other phrase that you used that I'd stopped you. What was it? A moment. What was the term that you had used earlier, and I stopped you?
Oh,
bringing meaning to.
Yeah, bringing meaning to. Yeah.
What is the meaning of this strategy that you want to show me? You want to show me like that built a $5 million AR at SaaS company. It was this very small moment. Like that's what I look for in a story is like, what is the moment that's almost the impetus to this journey? And it's hidden in the second point.
I worked with this excellent author years ago. He was an Emmy award-winning author, a journalist before he ever got into B2B content. And something that he did with every single article, because he did case studies. I had him on the case studies because he had this interview experience and it was like the perfect thing, is he would always start with the middle of the story, like you're talking about. It would be like, here's what they did, here's the results. And it was always a promise on what the headline was saying. And then it was, here's the backstory on how they got to that point, right? And I think as editors, as authors, as content creators, we always feel like it has to be, and that's this is the same, in this case, it's the same thing as a lot of other things, a lot of other pieces of content, is you start at the very beginning. Here is the backstory of how we got to the point. Here's what they did. Here are the results, all the way down at the bottom. Right. And if we assume that nobody cares, right? Which we had a guest on a few weeks back. His name was Praveen Kumar, who he was at Shopify before he's at his current company. He actually has the Post-it note on there on his screen that says, nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right. We have to make them care, and making them care is so much of that is in the structure. It's not even necessarily the content itself. It's how you've structured it that makes them care. Can you talk about the structure of this just a little bit more?
Yeah.
Or
so
like your impression on the structure as you were reading it?
Yeah, the impression, I think it's, in my opinion, too linear, right? So we come into this, I want to show you, it sounds like I'm going to show you a unique strategy. It's a moat, right? It's this one thing that CoSchedule has that can't be duplicated. Yet it takes a while to get to that point. And the structure in the beginning, to me, is a lot of information. It's kind of like going to the dentist, right? And you know you need a root canal, but the dentist tells you all the history of your teeth, and it's just like, it's too much to get to the main point. The main point is I need a root canal. That's why my teeth is hurting right now. The reason that I love that, there's two reasons why I love, and it's the same two reasons when I think about content, what I go to look for. What's the story? How do I show that story? And immediately it says, some months ago, I sent a pitch. that did not get approved. So I got rejected. That's a conflict. In storytelling, you always need a conflict. What's the barrier that you need to overcome? But what I love is he's actually showing the email as to what the guy had said to him. Like, I'm going to decline the pitch because the word, and it doesn't make this guy seem like he's a jerk by saying, no, we don't want your article. He says, if you have any other ideas, feel free to pitch. Again, this brings me on a journey. Okay, I did this wrong the first time. How do I go back and do it right? Now I'm doing more research on this company to realize, wait, they're making a lot of money. And here's why they're making a lot of money. They understand their blue ocean strategy. That to me makes it more exciting. Now the structure can begin to take place when we talk about beats, when we talk about rhythm. Now we have a rhythm, but we can keep coming back to this story that started out with, I got rejected. How do I not only make it better, but how do I use this as a lesson to teach you? I think, so there's a lot going on in this article, because even as I was reading through it the first time, one other part that got confusing for me is that there was a strategy 1 and then 4 points of the strategy 1, but then I saw strategy 2 and I was like, wait, what happened? Why did we go back in reverse? So after we leave 4, we come to strategy number 2. So to me, the structure is a bit off in understanding, because I don't think it was ever explained that we would be broken down into 3 strategies. So I think that's the other thing that could have been explained better, that here's what you're getting ready to get into, because this is a long article. We're going to first break down strategy 1, strategy 2, and strategy 3. And in between the strategies, I'm going to teach you, we're going to go deeper into that. That's the other part of the structure that I didn't really understand. It's kind of like when you're listening to music and then they decide to switch up the tempo and they don't tell you they're going to switch up the tempo, or like music that has a skit in it, right? Like, I don't know if we can politically use his name. I mean, yeah, use his name, but R. Kelly used to have skits in between his music, right? And I think he did one with the Isley Brothers where they were going back and forth, but at least you knew they were going back and forth. They kind of took you on that journey because it started with a skit, then they slowed down the music, they started the skit again. And so that's what I feel like this article is doing, is like it took me somewhere that I didn't understand where I was going.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think of like structure is like, again, I'm not just structuring it where I'm thinking of the story, but how do I guide someone on this journey? How do I narrate it for them? Right? If you're watching a movie and there's a narrator, he's narrating part of the movie for you, right? Like I think Mark Wahlberg has a funny movie like that where he's coming back in and narrating the movie to you, but he explained that he would do that. And I don't know that this article did that for me.
One of the things that's really interesting to me and I'm curious about is how often are you looking at other people's content to do this? I think that's a good question for me to ask, because the second part of that, question B on that is, how are you identifying what the ideal structure would be if you're looking at another person's piece?
It's a great question, Tommy. One of my favorite writers is Malcolm Gladwell.
Ooh.
Malcolm Gladwell takes these not even complicated, sometimes they're not even complex ideas, but he breaks it down and he makes it entertaining, right? He makes it entertaining. He makes it easy to digest. He takes you on this journey, this wild journey. You have no idea where he's going sometimes, but then, like one of my favorite books that he wrote recently was Talking to Strangers. And it's this idea that people aren't always going to do what we expect them to do, just based off of human psychology. So how do I break that down? I literally take out a pen and paper sometimes, and I'm looking at, okay, what is Malcolm Gladwell doing here? Okay, he's telling a story here, but how does he start the story? The same thing, the reason I like Malcolm Gladwell as an example is because Malcolm Gladwell writes really well, but then he also has his podcast, Revisionist History, where he's also using content. You asked earlier about, like, how do you take something that you used to do visually or something that you used to write and now turn it into a different medium? I think it's the same thing. You're just using the structure. And I notice the way that Malcolm Gladwell likes to write is it's almost like you're in a classroom setting. He is a professor, so it's almost like you're in a classroom setting. He's just trying to dissect this idea. He calls it a biography of an idea. And so I will literally write out on paper. I'm looking, okay, I'll read through it first, just kind of like how we did here. We'll read through the article, but then I'll go back and it's like, okay, how did he start the story? What is it he telling me in the beginning? And then what are the points that he's making along the path as he's telling me this? So like if he opens up with, I don't know, in Talking to Strangers, he opens up with the story of Sandra Bland and how that situation unfolded with the police officer, how it actually wasn't as crazy as people thought, but there was this one moment that changed everything. And it was the moment where she lit her cigarette. And the police officer was telling her to put out the cigarette. And now he's expecting one thing, she's expecting another. And but they're talking to strangers. They're meeting at this point in life. They don't know each other. And that's the whole premise of his book. And I'm like, okay, how did he get me here? Right? How did Malcolm Gladwell get me to this point where I understand people aren't going to respond the way that you expect them to respond? I'm trying to break that down. I'm literally just writing it out. Where I get that idea from is I believe it was Benjamin Franklin. I read it in a book where Benjamin Franklin wanted to become a better writer. So he would write by hand. He would get this article a newspaper article, and he would write it out by hand, and then he would try to memorize it to rewrite it so that he'd understand and digest how this person is writing this article. I kind of do the same thing. And I use Malcolm Gladwell because he's actually a person I'm studying now, and how he writes his books, how he writes his articles. He writes, I believe, for the New Yorker, and how he's doing his podcast. The idea behind my audiobook part of it came from what Malcolm Gladwell was doing with his content, where he wasn't just reading to you or doing Q&As. He was bringing you behind the scenes of the Q&A when he would go interview someone.
Mm-hmm.
He would stop and explain certain moments when the person is talking about a story or they're bringing up jargon that you may not understand. He'd slow the story down so you understand it, and then he'd get back to the story, right? That's how I kind of break down articles, is I'm looking at who do I think is a great writer, who took me on a journey that like I couldn't put the book down. How do I break that to recreate it, right? How do I recreate the same feeling? Because I love the way it made me feel.
Right.
How do I do that? How do I do that again?
There's a lot of focus on technique in what you're talking about. A lot of focus on technique, which doesn't get talked about nearly enough, especially in the content marketing space. Now, I would love it if in the follow-up email, you could help me, come up with some resources that teach technique, right? I'm a big fan of Story by Robert McKee, right? Like Save the Cat, right? That's another one. I study a lot of filmmaking technique to incorporate that into my writing. Video games too. I was reading a book called Glued to Games, which is about video game design, and how they will constantly use these feedback loops to keep hooking you into this virtual world with constraints, right?
Oh, wow.
How can you get immersed in a world that gives you freedom, but there's obviously constraints within that world, right?
Yeah.
So if you could help me by sending some resources to focus on technique for the audience, that would be wonderful. The question then becomes, though, after you've learned technique, how are you communicating technique? And then if we bring it back into the edit, how would you communicate that technique to the author?
That's a great question. So I think, how would I communicate technique? There's one way, very simple, and that's just to read your article out loud. So if I were to read this article out loud, I wouldn't even read the whole thing. Let's just take the first page of this. In 2010, Garrett Moon and Justin Walsh co-founded Today Made, a web development agency based in North Dakota. While running the agency, they discovered that most of their clients find it challenging to effectively manage their social media and editorial calendar. It's a tongue twister. It doesn't feel conversational. So I would read out loud with them so that they understand the technique of, this is your first paragraph, and I think writing should always lead you to want to read more. This doesn't lead me there. Right?
It's monotone in its musicality.
It's monotone. Right. This pushed them to build a marketing software solution, and by March 2013, CoSchedule was born. Again, I'm not understanding, why do I care about this? What is it that I'm going to take away from this? 8 years later, or 8 years after launching the company from the Peace Garden state, they've achieved the following. Great, a lot of stats, but why should I care about any of this? I have limited time. Why should I care? Now, as I'm reading through this, I would do similar to what we did, and I'd look at, all right, let's keep looking through here. Let's keep looking through. Where's the, you buried the lead, which is in number 2. Some months ago, I sent a pitch to write a guest post. Here's the other thing that I found fascinating. This is, and it's probably why it stood out to me. At this point, the article had a voice. Whereas in the beginning, and the reason it had a voice is because it says, some months ago, I sent a pitch. When I'm asking, why should I care? We like to care and we like to connect with people. This first page does not connect with anybody other than information. So if I were to, again, going back to technique, I think the way that I would teach technique is teaching the structure of it. We don't get into who is writing this piece until number 2, where the person introduces themselves to say, I sent a pitch to write a guest post for CoSchedule.
And we're on what, page 5, page 6?
I think this is page 5. Is that right? No, page 6. You're right. Page 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everything else before that is disconnected. There isn't an I. There isn't a. It's just a bunch of information. And I honestly didn't notice that the first time reading this through, but I'm realizing it now. Like, that's the other thing. There's got to be personality. Who are we connecting with? Even if, honestly, and I've seen this done before, I don't think it's wrong. Even if you were to connect me to a fake avatar or a fake person that's within the company to say, this is our writer. Because I know some companies think about, well, what if we have a writer that leaves and now these people have connected to the writer? Have a person that's never going to leave. You might change the writer, like the person that's actually typing it up, but the personality is the same person. It's the same, like, is it, I don't know, Maggie from the marketing department. But Maggie is never going to leave the company because Maggie's a fake person. And you could, and again, I've seen this done before where the company even says Maggie's a fake person, but we want you to feel connected to someone here that is real. We've just decided to change the name. Right? I create documentaries for entrepreneurs, and the reason that I love telling the stories of entrepreneurs is because you get to it's like what we talk about with the CEO can often be removed from the people they're serving. We bring it back to this connection where you get to understand the mission and vision from not just a high level perspective, but from the perspective of the person, the founder that created it. And I think that's what this article is missing. It's missing voice. It's missing personality. And that's how I'd walk through with the writer. How do you bring more technique into this so that it's entertaining and people actually want to read it? Because right now, if I'm honest, I think we're both falling asleep trying to read this. So that's how I would go through it.
All right. We're near the end here. If you could give me the 1-minute wrap up, the main takeaway of all of it, what would that be?
The main takeaway would be start with a story. Give it a voice. That's it. There's a story in there that was hidden that we found. I would move that to the front. I think it's a lot of great information. I'm sure it would lead someone on the right journey, but you start with the story, and that makes people care to even want to read the rest.
Jude, that was awesome. It really was. Thank you so much for coming on to the show. I really, really appreciate it. This was an incredibly unique perspective. For anyone who's following along the journey of this show, it would be fantastic. Hold on, let's see if we can actually get the editing to work here. It would be fantastic if you were to follow along on YouTube. We post the long videos there, but we also are doing shorter clip versions along the way. And it would be, awesome if you wanted to subscribe, tell people about the show, everything that we're trying to do here. I really, really appreciate it. We've got links in the chat here. Thank you so much, Jude, for coming on, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Tommy, thank you for having me, man.
It was a pleasure. My pleasure.